must wait a moment.
So today I want to go over an updated and optimized version of the strongest Druid build in Season 6, and this is going to be a pure landslide build. Now, as this is the ultimate version of this build, we're going to be using a lot of uniques. We're going to be using 2 mythics with the Shroud of False Death and the Ring of Starless Skies, and then we're going to be using a handful of normal uniques with the Vasily's Prayer, with Wild Heart Hunger, and with the Earthbreaker. So this version of this build is going to require quite a lot of gear, but you don't actually need all of this for the build to just work. This is going to be the optimized version of it. And that brings us to our skill tree, starting with our basic skill, which is going to be Claw. This is primarily to shapeshift us into Werewolf and back into another form to proc other effects. Upgrade 1 increases attack speed, but this is primarily to get lower in the tree. Now, I know a lot of other versions of this build are using Shred. They'll go Shred, they'll go Enhanced Shred, and then they'll go Primal Shred. So all 3 attacks of the Shred are transformed into dashes. This is primarily for movement, but Shred does have a pretty high spirit cost, so you can run out of spirit a lot. And you're using 3 additional skill points into Shred, while also still needing the 2 skill points for your basic skills. So you lose a good amount of skill points for passives, and I just think our movement is generally good enough anyway. But then 5 points into Landslide as our main damaging ability. Upgrade 1 can make it Landslide immobilize. Upgrade 2, when you immobilize or stun an enemy, you gain a Terror Mote. When you attack bosses, you have a chance to gain Terror Motes. And when landslides hit an enemy, they consume a Terror Mote to deal increased critical strike damage. So you're just going to want a lot of CC, more focus on immobilizes in this build, so you have tons of guaranteed crits and critical strike damage off of that. Then we're going down into Earthen Bulwark. This is just a pretty decent barrier, but a big reason we're taking this is upgrade 1 makes you unstoppable. Then we're going down to Debilitating Roar, just reduces the damage all enemies around you are dealing. Then we're going down to Debilitating Roar, just makes all enemies around you deal less damage. Upgrade 1 fortifies you, and upgrade 2, which is the primary reason we're taking this, we deal increased damage while this is active, so more multiplicative scaling. Then we're going down, we're taking a Poison Creeper. This ability is primarily to poison enemies. Mixed in with one of our legendary aspects, it also spawns a bunch of landslides for more damage. Upgrade 1 increases the immobilize and poison, and upgrade 2 increases the poison duration. Then we're going down, we're taking our ultimate that we're putting 5 points into, and this is Petrify. Use it, it stuns everything around you. Upgrade 1 makes all enemies hit by this take increased critical strike damage. That critical strike damage is increased against bosses. And then upgrade 2, when you kill an enemy hit by this, it reduces the cooldown, and when you hit a boss, it just reduces the cooldown. And that brings us into our passives, starting with 1 into Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulses. Your core skills cost more but deal a lot more damage. Then we're going down, we're getting 3 into Ancestral Fortitude to increase your resistances. If you have max out resistances from other pieces of gear or through your Paragon boards, you can remove points out of this, but we're kind of capped on other things we can put points into to become stronger. Then 3 into Vigilance, you gain DR after using a defensive. We have 2 defensives, so this will be up a lot. Then 3 into Backlash, you deal increased damage after you use a defensive skill. Then we're going down, I have 1 point into Clarity, which after we use our Poison Creeper, our next core skill deals more damage and has increased critical strike chance. This is primarily just because we don't have a lot of other things to increase our damage. Then 3 into Feral Aptitude, you deal increased damage while healthy and more increased damage while above 100% movement speed. These bonuses can stack, so there's just a lot of increased damage. Going down to 3 into Crushing Earth, your Earth skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. Then 3 into Stone Guard, when you have Fortify for over 50% of your max life, your Earth skills deal more damage. And we have 3 points into both of these just because of more optimizations. As you'll see, we have a lot of additional passive points into a lot of these passives, and this is just from our pieces of gear, so we can take some points out of other defensive passives and make sure we have them in all offensive passives. Then we have 1 into Mending. This is primarily to get 3 into Provocation. While you remain in Werebear form for a certain amount of time, your next non-defensive skill will Overpower. Overpower actually gives us a pretty big burst of damage, so you're going to want to have this max out. Then we're putting 3 points into Defiance. Nature skills deal increased damage to elites. 3 into Natural Disaster, so our Earth skills do increased damage to vulnerable enemies, 3 into catastrophe. You deal increased damage after casting your ultimate. This is also another reason why having the 5 points into petrify may be better than putting those points into something else. And then we have 1 point into defensive posture just as another additional point. This is primarily for the DR while fortified. Then we have 3 points into quick shift. Shapeshifting into a new animal form grants you increased damage. This stacks up quite a bit, and this bonus is only lost when you're in human form for 3 seconds. So just use one of your shapeshifting abilities and it'll stop the duration from reducing. Then finally, for our capstone, when shapeshifting, Werebear grants 30% increased damage, and Werewolf grants 20% increased attack speed. Both of these bonuses persist as long as you are in either form and are lost after 3 seconds in human form. So you just shapeshift into both of these, then you make sure you're not in human form for too long, and these will both be up at all times. And that brings us to our spirit boons: Wariness to take reduced damage from elites, Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage, Pack Leader, which is a lucky hit where crits have a chance to reset your companion skills so we can reset our poison creeper. Then we're taking Calm Before the Storm, a lucky hit. Nature skills can reduce the cooldown of your ultimate so we can petrify more. And then my last point I have into Obsidian Slam. Every 10th kill will cause your next earth skill to overpower. This is very good when you're not only going up against a boss, because our overpowers deal really good damage, will almost always overpower and crit, and because of how many landslides we proc on top of each other, we can summon one landslide that keeps proccing a bunch of landslides, and those will continue to overpower. Now, if you need more survivability, you can go into Iron Feather for a pretty big max life increase, but with this build, once you get to this point, we have so many passives that reduce our damage taken, increase our life, that you really don't need any more defensives. This is one of, if not the most tanky builds in the game. And then we have our mercenaries, and you can use pretty much whatever you want. The one thing I would recommend is for your reinforcement, you use Rahir and you use his Bastion ability, which he'll basically just summon a bubble where it'll redirect 90% of the damage that would be dealt to you or your allies to him for 5 seconds. And I think he's unkillable in this, so basically a 90% damage reduction for 5 seconds. When you cast it, you also gain unstoppable for 1 second. And what you can do is apply this so when you become injured is when he casts this. Now, a big issue I'm finding and why I may actually be changing this is because when you're at this point of this build, I rarely get this to proc because I almost never get to that low health. Now, if you're say running high pit runs, you'll definitely still want this, but I might be changing this up just to get more damage or some other utility. And then for my primary mercenary, when you're playing solo, I'm using the Barbarian. Now, you can use the Archer because some of his passives do have a better damage increases overall. One of them gives you like a 25% increased critical strike damage, which is multiplicative, which is very good. His tracking ability that tracks everything on your minimap is actually really bad. It covers up a bunch of other icons, so I just don't want to deal with that. So I just use the Barbarian, primarily because we have Hysteria, which you gain increased attack speed whenever the Barbarian damages anything, and this will stack up to 10%, so more attack speed. And then Bloodthirst, when the Barbarian uses this, she also gives you 10% increased attack speed, so that'll be good for more attack speed. And then you gain even more attack speed with Bloodlust when she uses Bloodthirst. So this is just a lot of attack speed. Attack speed is actually really good in this build once you get to the point where you don't have spirit issues as well. And that brings us to our Paragon boards, and we're primarily going to be going over the board and glyph selection. If you want to follow point by point, there'll be a build planner in the description, but because of how the Paragon boards are now, because you can only have 5 boards total, you pretty much just want to follow the board and glyph selection, and you want to put points into other areas you need a lot more. So for instance, if you need more resistances, you would want to start going towards the rare and magic resistance nodes. If you have your resistances and armor, you then want to start to go towards more damage increases. So once you have all of the glyphs and boards you need, you're basically just going to go to whatever rare and magic node cluster you want to go to is. Our starting board, we're going to be using Headhunter as our glyph. This buffs all normal nodes within range. This will actually help a bit, but the secondary gives us increased damage to elites, and the legendary just gives us increased damage. The first board we're taking is Heightened Malice. While there are 3 or more poison enemies nearby, you deal increased damage. Then the glyph we're taking is Spirit. This is an increase to your critical strike damage. Your secondary is your crits make the enemies take increased damage from you, stacking up, and the legendary gives you increased critical strike damage. Then we're taking the Earth and Devastation board. Your Earth skills deal increased critical strike damage. This is increased by your damage versus crowd controlled up to 60%. You want to make make sure you have this capped out at 60%. The glyph we're taking is Earth and Sky, a bonus to magic nodes within range, more damage to crowd controlled, more earth damage. Then the secondary nature skills deal increased damage to CC'd or vulnerable enemies. The legendary is increased nature magic damage. Then we're taking the survival instincts board. While in Werebear, you deal increased damage up to 60% for every 1% life difference between you and the enemy. So the enemy's health gets lower, yours stays higher, you keep dealing more and more damage. And then the glyph we're taking is Outmatch, a bonus to rare nodes within range. And this is actually really strong because this will give us more max life, more damage in Werewolf, more damage in Werebear. And then the secondary is increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. And the legendary is just increased damage. Then for our final board, we're taking Ancestral Guidance. After spending 75 spirit, you will deal increased damage. This will be up majority of the time. The glyph we're taking is Fang and Claw, another bonus to magic nodes. So more damage, more core skill damage. The secondary is while you're in Werebear or Werewolf, close enemies take more damage from you. The legendary is increased damage while shapeshift. And that brings us to our gear, starting with our gems. In your armor, you're going to want willpower. That's going to give you multiplicative increases. In your jewelry, you're going to want increase to resistances. When you're at this part of the build, you don't need more armor. So just get whatever gems you need for resistances. And then that brings us to our runes. Now, there are a bunch of different mixes you can do, but the mix I have found that I like the most is first off being the Tam Watt mixture, which is cast a non-channeled core skill, which our skills are. So this is going to be proc constantly. And when casting 4 of those, you invoke the Necromancer's or Decrepify, which slows enemies, reduces their damage, and it lets you execute them. Now it is a low health execute, like 5%. That does technically increase your damage by a bit and just CCs enemies a bit. What's really strong with this is when you mix this with the Zol mixture. So you invoke a skill from another class. Once you do that 4 times, you invoke the Barbarian's Warcry, increasing your damage by 15% for 6 seconds. This is multiplicative, and because we proc our first runes so much, we'll proc our Barbarian Shout a ton as well. So all of these will be proccing a lot, giving us pretty decent damage increases. Now also, I have seen a lot of builds where people are using two-handed weapons, but they're using gems in their two-handed weapon instead of a rune. Now this generally is going to give you less damage because even though you can get, say, a pretty big damage increase to crit damage, that is additive, and using gems for your main stat is multiplicative. So generally, it's going to be better to have runes in your weapon. If you're using a two-handed weapon, you can't do this with one-handed. And that brings us to our unique. So starting off, we have Vassalie's Prayer. Your Earth skills are now also Werebear skills, which is a primary reason we're taking this. They also fortify you for some percent of your max life. This is also going to be good because this helmet has some pretty decent rolls on it. Actually, it's a really defensive helmet, but the percentage willpower roll is pretty good for damage, but you're also getting that armor roll, which helps you get to your armor cap. As you can see, I'm only slightly over armor cap, but that's just because I'm so progressed into this. And then for our boots, we're using Wild Heart Hunger, which is shapeshifting into a new animal form, increases the value of your Bestial Rage, which is our capstone, by 5% up to 50% depending on your roll. This decays by 2% per second. Now, primarily how you're going to be doing this is when you're in normal combat, so not against a boss, you just use your Poison Creeper and then use your landslide. That will shapeshift you and that will proc this. But when you're on a boss, what you want to do is go into a boss. You want to be using Claw, landslide, and Poison Creeper back to back to constantly shapeshift you really quick to max out the amount of stacks you can get on this. And then once you're maxed out on stacks, you can just Poison Creeper and landslide to keep those stacks up because this will give you massive attack speed and damage increases stacking this. Then for our final normal unique, we have Earthbreaker. This is a very important part of the build because now casts of landslide leave behind this small AoE on the ground, and when you cast more landslides into that AoE, it has a chance to spawn additional landslides. This Earthbreaker also has a chance for landslide projectiles to cast twice as another roll. That is actually a really big spot where I can get an upgrade because I don't have a greater affix or even any masterworks on my chance for landslide projectiles to cast twice. So if you can get a greater affix roll and get masterworks on that, you'll generally be doing a lot more damage than I am. But we also have 2 mythics, starting with Ring of Starless Skies. Spending your primary resource reduces the resource cost of your skills and increases their damage. Pretty obvious why this is incredibly strong. But then we have the chest piece that has finally been activated, which is the Shroud of False Death. Now this is actually much less used for its effect, but its effect is if you haven't dealt damage in the last 2 seconds, gain stealth and 40% move speed. And then one of the affix rolls is you getting a pretty big chunk of additional damage when exiting stealth or the first attack out of stealth. But the primary reason we're using this is because it's a chest piece with +1 to all passives. Chest pieces usually don't give you damage increases, but +1 to all passives is an absurdly high damage increase and defensive increase. If you go through all of the passives on a druid, you're getting something crazy like over 100% multiplicative damage. You're gaining massive amounts of DR, you're gaining movement speed. So just a +1 to all passives on this chest piece makes it use. In fact, if you removed everything else from this item and just had +1 to all passives, you would probably still use this chest piece. But on top of that, its max life got massively buffed and its all stats got massively buffed. Now, a big reason why all stats is so good is because on Paragon boards, all of the rare and magic nodes got buffed, but rare nodes have the secondary effect that you need to get a certain amount of stats to get that secondary effect. When you get the Shroud of False Death and fully upgraded, it gives you almost all of the secondary effects for all of your rare nodes. In fact, I have all of the secondary effects of every rare node in my Paragon boards except one, and that one requires like 2,500 willpower, but I have all of the others. So this is actually a massive damage increase, getting this huge roll to all stats as well. And that brings us to our legendary aspects on our weapon, and you're going to want to be using a two-handed weapon. We have landslides, earth pillars, each strike a second time and deal some amount of increased damage up to 31% per hit. So now when we landslide, it does it a second time, always at a minimum. And we will obviously have a bunch of other ways to proc even additional landslides on top of that. And then on our necklace, your core skills deal some amount of increased damage based on your fortified. This is multiplicative. This was buffed this season, so just massive damage increase. Then for our other offensive aspect, Poison Creeper's active, also cast landslide in a circle around you. That'll also do it multiple times, and your earth skills do increased damage to poisoned enemies. And then for our defensive, when you use a shapeshifting skill that changes your form, heal for up to 25% of your max life, which is already big. If you are at full life, you gain the same amount as fortify. And even though this build is super tanky, anytime you take damage, you basically just do anything that shapeshifts you, and it gives you a massive heal. This will also be increased through some of our passives, so this is a huge heal. Now, like mentioned, there'll be a build planner in the description if you want to find all of the best affixes you should be going for. Some of the more important ones are on your weapon, specifically the most important ones. One of them being the lucky hit, up to a 15% chance to restore some amount of your primary resource as you upgrade. Mine is over 100%, so it just gives you 100% of your spirit. Because of how landslide works, because it constantly procs new landslides from a single landslide, your lucky hit is actually crazy. So this is actually the primary way in which you regain your spirit. We already have a bunch of reductions, but this is how you regain your spirit. Then we also have another chance for landslide projectiles to cast twice as a temper, and both of those rolls are going to be probably the most important affix or temper rolls in this build. But that's the entirety of this pure landslide build, and from everything I've seen, this is absolutely, bar none, the strongest druid build in Season 6, and once you get to the point I'm at, you're doing pretty crazy damage. You're able to do all the content in the game, you're able to do pretty high pit runs, and one of the really good things about this build, even though its damage isn't up there with a lot of the S tier builds, this build is potentially the tankiest build in the game. We have ridiculous amounts of just straight damage reduction through a lot of our passives. Then we have increases to all of those passives through a lot of our uniques and through our mythic chest piece. You're dealing a lot of damage and you're just absurdly tanky. You really don't have to worry about dying pretty much ever when you're in Torment 4 using this build, just because of the ridiculous amount of DR you have. We also have a good amount of base life of 10k, even though we're not spam going into that. This build is the top of the line if you're playing a druid this season. But that's all I want to go over. So